Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the basic interface in Max. Just enough to get you started, and obviously we deal with a lot of these interface buttons up here in later tutorials. The basics of the whole program will eventually be covered. So we're just going to hit on the main ones here so you can start to maneuver through this first week and get these objects to do what you want them to do. The first thing that we'll go over are these great big areas. These big gray areas here are called viewports. And right now I'm right-clicking, which puts this yellow square around the active viewport. The active viewport is the viewport that you'll be working in. So if you right-click in the viewport, that'll select the viewport. And you want to get used to right-clicking because that'll leave your selections alive once you start selecting these objects. If you want to see different ways that these viewports can render, what you can do is go over here to Create, Geometry, make sure Standard Primitives is selected. Choose any of these, like a box, and just drag out the box and push it up. And I'm left-clicking there just to get some objects in the scene. And we're going to go over how to make these primitives here in a tutorial, about 2 more tutorials down the way. So don't worry about making these primitives right now, but if you want to go ahead and try, go ahead. And you can see that down here they're solid, but if I right-click on the name of the viewport and go down to Smooth Highlights, that will make them all solid. And that's just a shortcut. Also, this grid that you can see here, which is by default part of Max, I can hit the G button, then that will get rid of that grid if you want to. And you'll see me get rid of that grid in a lot of the tutorials because I don't like to leave it on. Okay, next up is our menus up here. And these buttons up here are all quick access buttons to things that we're going to want to use. I'm going to jump around a little bit here. The first one that I'm going to go over, this arrow, is Select. And if I have this depressed or active when it's yellow, I can now select by left-clicking on any object that I want. I can select that particular object. And you can tell the object is selected because you'll get this bounding box around it. When I'm in wireframe mode, you can see the object is selected when it turns white. And that's Select. I can also go to this next button, which is Select by Name, and you'll see that each of my objects is listed here, and I can double-click on that object, and I can select it by name if I want to. That's this button. The next button over is your selection type. This one, if you hold down the left mouse button, you'll see you get different selection types. Again, we'll go over these in a later tutorial, but if you want to play with those now, you can. This is the Windows crossing selection. When this is depressed or turned on, yellow, everything that I select around gets selected. When it's turned off, everything that I select through gets selected. The next button is our Move button. This is also the W button on the keyboard. You can see that if I go over here and hit W, it will activate it. And I just select anything in my viewport, and that will allow me to move it. And these gizmos here, or not gizmos, I'm sorry, transforms, will allow me to move that object that's selected. And if I grab this middle one, I can move it on 2 planes. You can do that in any viewport and get used to right-clicking to keep your selection alive. You can see if I left-click, it gets rid of the selection. If I right-click, the selection will stay put. So I just right-clicked and I can still move that. This button is your rotate button. It's also the E button on the keyboard, and it works the same as Move, in that you can get a hold of those transforms and move them around if you want. This is your Scale button, or the R button on the keyboard, and again it works very similar in that I can scale these objects in different ways by selecting it. All of these are called select and move, rotate, scale, which means you can select something by using these buttons and then scale it or rotate it. The next button we're going to talk about are your snaps over here. Now, we do cover these in a later video. The main reason we're going to cover them here is that when they're turned on, you may not get the results that you want. Like right now, this is a 3D snap that's turned on. So when I move my my box, you can see it's kind of snapping around there. It's actually snapping to the grid down below. And if you're not wanting that to happen and it's on by accident, that may bother you. So if you get some strange results in your viewport, look up here and make sure these are not turned on until we cover how to use them. And if you want to play around with them, you right-click on any of them, and that will bring up your grid and snap settings. And if you're used to snap settings in other programs, these are your snap settings. But again, we're going to go over those in a later tutorial. This is your selection groups over here, and we'll go over those again in another tutorial coming right up. This is your mirror button, and I can select an object, hit the mirror button. Well, it's not a good object to select. Why don't we select this one? Select the object and hit the mirror button, and you can see that I can make a mirror of my object just by moving the offset, and now I have two cylinders here. I'm going to cancel that. This is our align tool. We go over that later. You move the interface elements around by putting your cursor on an empty spot, like this is empty, and you'll get this little Mickey Mouse paw, and then hold down the left button, just hold it down and drag, and that will move these around. You're going to have to do that a lot in this program. So get used to kind of pushing or pulling those interface elements around. This is your animation curve editor. We won't go into that much in this class. This is your material editor, which we will go into a lot, and that's in, I think, week 4 or 5. We cover that in depth. We get into that quite a bit. This is your render scene dialog, and if I click this, this is where you set all of your render options. If you're used to other 3D programs, this is your size. You do your saving of your output right here under render output, and you would check that little box and it would save it. We'll go over that again pretty far into the class. We go over the rendering. And this button way over here is your quick render, and if I hit that, it just renders the scene. And if you'd like to save the scene from the quick render, it's this button right here. These tabs here, we get into the first 3 tabs quite a bit. The first one's create, the second one's modify, the next one is hierarchy. We get into these buttons a lot right off the bat. In fact, we get into them this week quite a bit. And you click on these tabs and you'll get lots more options will fall out under the tabs. So the first thing you usually look for when you're watching the videos is which tab is selected, and that will help you find the elements underneath it that I'm working with. And you'll usually see in the video some big blue arrows, especially in the earlier videos, that will guide you through that process. So look for the arrows. Up here, I can left click on any of these and I'll get a whole bunch of different options. We will get up into these quite a bit. Most of these also have buttons that do the same thing over here. So if, for instance, I'm doing lighting and you see me come up over here under advanced lighting, there may be a similar button over here depending on what parameters that light has. So it's very common for there to be 2 of the same option located in different spots in Max. These buttons over here are higher end, like collision buttons, particle systems, rigid body collections, cloth simulations, soft body collections. We will not get into these very much into this class, but your book does cover some of these if you want to look into that. Down below is our animation settings. The main one is auto key and keyframe. We get into these in a later class. or a later week in this class. We do a little bit of animation in this class, just enough to play with it. And then down here in the very bottom right, these 8 buttons help control our viewports, and we'll get into those in a later class, but you can see something like zoom. If I right-click, left-click, sorry, I'm really having trouble with the buttons today. If I left-click and hold down and move the mouse back and forth, I can zoom. This particular button in the very bottom right is your maximize viewport toggle, and that will maximize your viewport, or it'll put you back into your 4 viewport settings. Okay, so that's a brief tour of the interface itself. This particular file will be available if you'd like to poke around with it, since we haven't really covered how to create primitives. And go ahead and move on to the next video, and you'll see a lot of this over again.